Hello, it's Tim here from Urban Dunia. Thanks for traveling with me. I am about to get onto the Utila Dream to head to, apparently, paradise in Honduras. Come with me. Hey everyone, I'm Tim, and I've just finished a 9-month odyssey around Latin America. Now I'm reopening my diaries, and this time I'm bringing you along with me. Week by week, country by country, all the colors, all the craziness, all the food, all the music, and all the splendor. 9 months when each morning was a new adventure. The road was my companion, and Latin America cast its spell on me. This is my Latin America Diaries. Welcome back to Latin America Diaries. It was time to return to the Caribbean side of Central America, so I woke up early in Guatemala City and then headed to one of the city's many bus stations, where I boarded a bus that would take me through Guatemala's beautiful countryside and down into its hot, humid lowlands towards the border with Honduras. The journey involved a couple of bus changes before I eventually arrived at the border. After completing the immigration formalities, I was waved into a shared van for the short drive to the town of Copán. Now, Honduras doesn't have the best reputation with travelers, especially of late. It's known for its high levels of crime, unfortunately, and many travelers simply bypass the country altogether. But tucked away in the forested hills on the western border of the country is one of Central America's greatest archaeological treasures. I arrived in the town of Copán and checked into the Hotel Iguana Azul, which was partnered with a lovely nearby bed and breakfast whose facilities guests were welcome to use during the quiet season. This immediately caught my eye and, well, ain't that the truth. Copán is a lovely little mountain town surrounded by lush green hills and coffee plantations. It's quiet, relaxed, and the sort of place where life seems to move at a different pace. But I hadn't come here just to see the town of Copán. The next morning, I woke up early and set out on foot to the ruins of Copán, situated just on the outskirts of town. Almost immediately, I found myself immersed in the Honduran jungle. Towering tropical trees arched overhead, vines hung from every direction, and echoing through the forest were the unmistakable squawks of scarlet macaws. These brilliant red birds are one of the symbols of Copán, and seeing them up amongst the canopy really completed the atmosphere. Copán was one of the great cities of the ancient Mayan civilization. When you stop to think that between here and the great Mayan cities of southern Mexico lies the entire country of Guatemala, you begin to appreciate just how vast the Mayan world really was. Even today, Copán is still an active archaeological site. Excavations continue beneath protective shelters scattered throughout the ruins, where archaeologists are still uncovering new pieces of this remarkable civilization. One thing that struck me was just how quiet the whole place was. There were barely any other visitors there. I could wander almost anywhere, taking my time exploring the plazas, temples, and carved monuments without feeling rushed. It felt as if I had the entire place to myself. That's one of the unexpected benefits of traveling somewhere like Honduras. For years, the headlines have kept so many people away. We'll get back to talking about security in Honduras a little bit later, but for now, it meant that I could explore one of the most magnificent ruin sites in Central America in pretty much complete solitude. Walking through the jungle was magical. Giant tree roots twisted themselves around ancient stone walls. Moss and vines slowly reclaimed centuries-old buildings, and everywhere there was this sense that nature and history had been quietly competing with one another for hundreds of years. It reminded me a lot of Palenque in Mexico, another spectacular Mayan city that I had visited months earlier. Both belonged to the same civilization, yet each had its own unique character. And then there were the macaws. I mean, I've seen parrots before, but these birds are huge. And seeing them up in the trees, I mean, their vivid colors, their plumage, it was spectacular. As I left the site, one of the local vendors sold me a small scarlet macaw charm. It had originally been made as an earring or perhaps a key ring, but I knew immediately what it would become, the Honduras charm for my bracelet. That evening I sat down to a dinner of pupusas with coleslaw. Although pupusas are most famously associated with neighboring El Salvador, they're also a staple here in western Honduras, and just as delicious. As the sun disappeared behind the forested hills surrounding Copán, I headed back to the Blue Iguana hostel, ready for my next day in Honduras. Copán was something of a litmus test for me for Honduras, because before I got to Honduras, I kept hearing about how terrible the place was and how dangerous it was, and I knew that Copán would be a great place to really sort of scope that out, because it sits only about 10 kilometers from the border with Guatemala, and Copán is known for being quite a sleepy and safe village, and I thought that if I got there and met other travelers that had traveled through Honduras without problems and met Honduran people who said that it was okay, then that would be a pretty good sign to disregard these sensational headlines and instead just continue traveling through under my own steam. And that's pretty much what happened. I got to Copán, I met a couple of other travelers, I met the people at the hostel, and they all said the same thing, that really Honduras has its problems, but a lot of those problems are concentrated in certain areas of the two major cities, San Pedro Sula and the capital, Tegucigalpa. And if you stay away from them and really just avoid dangerous parts of cities generally, then most people travel through Honduras without incident. So that gave me the confidence to continue. The next morning, I went back to the part of town where the Copán Ruinas are and waited for the bus which would take me onwards to interchange and then continue onwards to my next destination, which would be the island of Utila on the Caribbean coast. The road wound through lush green valleys and alongside rivers for several hours before arriving in San Pedro Sula, whose name unfortunately has become synonymous with Honduras's reputation for crime. In fact, San Pedro Sula was once called the homicide capital of the world. However, I would only be in the bus station, and I had been told that as long as you stay within the bus station and just keep moving, it's not really an issue. So I rocked up at the bus station at San Pedro Sula, and it was just a bus station. Busy, perfectly ordinary. From there, I boarded another bus for the coastal city of La Ceiba, gateway to Honduras's famous Bay Islands. Once I arrived in La Ceiba, the bus dropped me off not far from a Walmart, which bizarrely became my first and so far only trip to a Walmart anywhere in the world. I needed to go there because after my credit card issues in Ecuador, I was still sending money to myself via Western Union, and the Western Union branch in La Ceiba was in the Walmart. That evening I checked into Casa del Espuerd, a comfortable if rather quiet family-run guest house. The owners lived downstairs while the guest rooms occupied the upper floor. I had barely arrived before a tropical storm began to roll in from the Caribbean. As the sun set, the sky turned shades of peach, orange and purple behind towering storm clouds rolling in off the sea. And then the heavens opened. I ducked into a nearby restaurant for dinner, a hearty plate of tortillas, fried chicken, avocado, beans and slaw. It reminded me a lot of the comforting home-style meals that I'd eaten in neighboring Nicaragua. By the time I finished dinner, the rain was still hammering it down, so I called the host family at the Airbnb, who very kindly came and picked me up to make sure that I got back safe and dry. I got back to the homestay and collapsed into bed and got a good night's sleep. If you're finding all of this advice useful, then please consider giving this video a like. Subscribe to my channel and share it across your social media. And if you're really enjoying what you're seeing, then please tell your family and friends about my channel. It really helps me grow a bit of a community around what I'm doing here. It helps the channel grow, and I'd love to have them along for the ride. The next morning, it was time to set out for what I had really come to this part of Honduras for, and that is Utila Island. I headed down to the wharf in La Ceiba and boarded the Utila Dream Ferry. The Utila Dream Ferry is of a substantial size, however this part of the Caribbean does get unpredictably rough sometimes, so I chose to make the crossing over to Utila in the morning when the waters tend to be calmer. Thankfully the crossing was relatively smooth. There were a few bumps along the way but nothing too dramatic, and before long the low-lying silhouette of Utila appeared on the horizon. Utila is one of the two main tourist islands in Honduras Bay Islands, the other being Roatan. Roatan tends to attract more resort holidays and higher-end travelers, while Utila has earned a reputation as the more laid-back, backpacker-friendly, and much cheaper alternative. Very soon we were tying up at the dock on Utila Island, and stepping onto that island was like stepping into paradise. Colourful wooden Caribbean houses lined the waterfront, palm trees swayed in the breeze, and the sea was that impossible shade of turquoise that almost doesn't look real. Although Honduras itself was once a Spanish colony, the Bay Islands have a very different Caribbean history and culture, which gives them a distinct feel compared with the mainland. I had already experienced the Caribbean on this trip. I had been to Isla Holbox in Mexico months earlier, and I had also swum in the Caribbean in Santa Marta in Colombia. But this
was something different. This was like the Caribbean of my dreams. And this is one of the reasons why I think that Honduras might be one of the best kept secrets of Central America, because the country has a reputation that scares so many people away. But here I was on this palm-fringed, perfectly white sand beach, looking at the turquoise waters of the Caribbean in front of me in tropical heat. And I almost had the entire place to myself. Another reason for all that, though, is a diplomatic row, which is an ongoing issue between the UK and Honduran governments. And it means that many British travellers have a lot of problems, if not find it outright impossible, to get a visa for Honduras. If that applies to you, or if you're interested to hear about that, please make sure that you check out the Instagram reel that I have linked in the video description below. I checked into the Phoenix hostel, dropped off my bag, and almost immediately wandered down to the Reef bar, where the deal was simple: buy a drink and you could use the sun lounges for the rest of the afternoon. That sounded like an excellent arrangement. The resident dog had already claimed the bar as his own, wandering happily on top of the bar in search of attention, while I settled in with a cold drink overlooking the Caribbean. Eventually I couldn't resist the sea any longer. I hired a snorkel and then stepped down, slipping on the way mind you, but sank down into the crystal clear waters of the Caribbean. The underwater world was incredible. Schools of brightly colored tropical fish darted around the coral beneath me, and I hadn't even ventured very far from shore before I spotted my first stingray, resting almost motionless on the sandy seabed below. That was the moment that I realized that this island and Honduras is really something special. I kept swimming further out until I reached the edge of the reef, where the shallow sandy bottom suddenly dropped away into deep blue water. The coral here was extraordinary. Soft coral swayed gently with the movement of the waves, while brightly colored reef fish darted between them. Then, out of nowhere, enormous schools of fish drifted past like a caravan crossing the ocean, each moving in perfect synchrony. It was breathtaking. I had snorkeled on this journey before when I was in the Galapagos Islands, and that was incredible because of the particular types of animals that you see there and the marine life. However, here it was the sheer abundance of the marine life. Everywhere I looked, there was life. Corals stretched in every direction. Fish seemed to fill every corner of the reef, and once again, there were hardly any people around. Like I said, Central America's best kept secret. I surfaced again just in time to see that there was another tropical storm brewing, so I packed up my things and reluctantly headed back to the hostel. That evening I headed out for a dinner of baleadas, Honduras' best known dish. It's essentially a thick flour tortilla filled with refried beans and cheese, folded over and served warm. Almost like a Honduran version of a calzone, although much lighter. Before I left Honduras, there was one more tradition that I needed to take care of. It was time to celebrate the Honduran edition of my 40th birthday. The next morning, I headed down to a local bakery that made some of the most incredible cinnamon rolls that I've ever seen. As tempting as they were, they didn't really feel very Caribbean, so instead I wandered a little further down the road and found a slice of key lime pie. Key lime pie isn't really Honduran, but it is absolutely Caribbean, so it felt right. I took my slice of pie down to the beach and celebrated another country's edition of my birthday beside the turquoise Caribbean Sea. With that done, I decided to roll out my towel and set up at my place on the beach where I would be for the rest of the day. A local Honduran family came to the beach while I was there and decided to set up camp right next to me. Like, they had the entire beach, but they were sitting like right next to me. What the hell is wrong with some people? I moved to another part of the beach and spent another couple of hours there. Later that day, I headed over to the old airport road near Ted's Point, which is on another side of the island. And this area has lots of coral reefs that you can swim on, but not really a beach to launch off. You just kind of go down a side lane, and between two privately owned properties which face onto the waterfront, the road just kind of ends, and then from there you launch yourself off and then swim out to a buoy, which denotes where I think it was called the Blue Hole, or possibly the Moon Hole is. I took my camera back into the water and continued exploring. It wasn't quite as spectacular as the reef that I'd snorkeled on over at the reef bar, but it was still beautiful. Strange coral formations rose from the seabed, colourful reef fish drifted lazily around the rocks, and the visibility was crystal clear. It was the perfect goodbye to Utila Island and Honduras that had become one of the most surprising places in Central America. The next morning I walked with my luggage down to the wharf and took the Utila Dream Ferry back towards the mainland at La Ceiba and continued my journey from there. Now this time I wasn't taking the ferry early just because I wanted to avoid rough waters, but also because in La Ceiba I would need to arrive early enough to meet a tourist shuttle that would take me onwards to my next destination. My next destination is an important one because it is in Latin America, although technically it's not really Latin America. It's also the second last destination of my trip, and it is the last new country that I would be visiting on this entire journey. To find out where that is, make sure that you like, share and subscribe, and tune in again next time on Latin America Diaries.